The Greek colonization of the Mediterranean and Black Sea coasts gave rise to many modern cities, and one of these cities was Massalia, present-day Marseille in southern France. Being an important player in the western Mediterranean and one could say the main trade competitor of Carthage, Massalia became an ally of Rome and helped the latter in the Punic Wars, for which it gained a niche in trade with Iberia. However, I do not know any ally of Rome which would not later become part of it, which happened to Massalia. During the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, not without pressure, it sided with the latter, for which was conquered by the former. The city itself didn't suffer much from this conquest, though, and moreover became the center of Greek culture in the already established Roman Empire, mainly because it was easier for the Romans to reach. Not a terrible fate. But could it have maintained its independence? Welcome to the Synthetic History channel, where we talk about events that didn't happen as if they did. And today I will tell the story of Massalia's emergence not so much as a polis, but as a large state, using Imperator Invictus as a storytelling tool. So, Greek colonization. It was a long process, taking about 2 centuries. And if we add the time of colonization of the west coast of Asia Minor and the Aegean Islands, we can count 4 centuries, from the 10th to the 6th century BC. Speaking of Massalia, it was founded very close to its end, somewhere in 600 BC, which is not surprising, given its location on the edge of the Greek world. According to one version of the name, Massalia literally means far beyond the sea, and the fact that it was founded by the inhabitants of the Ionian city of Phocaea, as well as most of the cities in this region, and that in turn was founded kind of under the patronage of Athens, a colony of a colony, roughly speaking. At the same time, the new city got rid of the status of the backwater quite quickly, just a century. This was due to 2 factors. Firstly, it is a great geographical location of the city. Such cities were not put anywhere, after all. And the location was good both in global and local plans. The city became a link in trade with northwestern Europe, in particular with Britain, which was a large region of tin mining. And without tin, as it is known, bronze cannot be made. And at the time, bronze was still more important than iron, so the profit from such trade was high. From Kernov, it and other goods were transported along the river Liger, then overlapped to the river Rhone, and then got to the port of Massalia, located in a beautiful deep bay, on both sides protected from the winds by hills, and from where the goods in turn went wherever needed. So the city was very attractive to merchants. The second factor in this rapid development was the Persians, or rather Persian. In the middle of the 6th century, Cyrus the Great conquered Asia Minor, and the Phocaeans, unwilling to recognize the new power, moved en masse to their colonies, first of all Massalia. Thus, its population quickly jumped to a good for average polis 20,000 people. And the polis is not just a city, it is a certain social order, in which each citizen of the city made his contribution to the development and defense of the polis, and for this had an influence on its policy. Democracy, in a word. But with time, the richest merchants from among the first settlers swept the policy of the polis under themselves and changed the regime to oligarchy. Now, all decisions were made by 600 people from 600 richest families, and being engaged in commercial activity was mandatory to become a member of this council. Of these 600, 15 magistrates were elected, who were the executive power, of which 3 magistrates had supreme authority, and one of them became Epistatos, the head of the council. By the 4th century, the population of the city had grown to 50,000. And they began to establish their colonies on the Gulf of Gaul, which, thanks to their proximity to the metropolis, were dependent on it, while retaining the freedom of self-government. More distant colonies and cities founded by Phocaeans were more independent and formed a kind of trade league with Massalia to protect themselves from the influence of the Carthage. These colonies were founded and existed with the consent of the native population, who were interested in trade relations with civilization. But as time went on, the Greeks, as I said, became more numerous and insolent, occupying lands farther and farther away from the city. By the beginning of the 3rd century, the discontent of the local Celto-Ligurian population, Salic tribes surrounding Massalia, reached a critical value, and they, united in a coalition of tribes, went to war on it. Well, at least so wrote the Greek historians, and information from the other side we obviously do not have. And as I often say, such information should be taken with a degree of skepticism. Although here kind of sounds like the truth. Archaeological excavations confirm at least 2 past battles between Greeks and barbarians in the vicinity of Massalia. And the Massalian oligarchy couldn't have suddenly wanted expansion. Could they? Anyway, this was the first serious war between them and the barbarians. We are talking about clashes of thousands of soldiers. Gauls, with the numerical superiority, took the city in a siege, which turned into an assault. But the Massalian militia awaited reinforcements in the form of mercenaries and defeated the united army of barbarians. And then went on a counterattack, looting and seizing local settlements, without meeting much resistance. But then the next problem arose. When you fight with barbarians, it is not very clear where the tribes that attacked you end, and where begin the tribes that heard about you only because of the fact that you have a trade route here, especially when you haven't maintained diplomatic ties before. Well, it seems the Massalians didn't realize that the Salis who attacked them were over, and decided that they should continue to fight the barbarians as long as they had the strengths. And the Greeks apparently had a lot of strengths to fight, because they fought almost without a break for 20 years. But of course, it was the good old wars. 40% of walking, 35% of sieges, 20% of plundering, 5% of battles. The numbers, by the way, were made up by me. So it was tolerable for the soldiers. During this time, they even managed to acquire those very diplomatic ties, and made alliances with the Taurini and Arverni tribes, which in the future under Greek influence became republics themselves. And even fought together with these guys against other guys. Not much is known about these barbarians whatsoever. What we do know, however, is that at this point they were themselves fighting against each other, which naturally played into the hands of the Greeks, who won victory after victory over the weakened barbarians. The strongest among their opponents were the tribes of Vocontii, who at the time had just conquered their neighbors and gathered an army of about 10,000. They also provided the greatest resistance to the Massalian invasion, at least so it can be judged by the numbers of battles mentioned by the Greeks. But even they were defeated and subdued. And about others there is nothing to narrate. All followed the classical scheme. Looting, general battle, siege of something resembling a fortress, slaughter or expulsion of local leaders. The main thing here is not the process, but its result. So let's discuss it. Having gained victory after victory over the barbarians, the Massalians faced the question: what to do with the defeated and their lands? Usually, after such conflicts with the barbarians, the Greeks simply took prisoners as slaves, but they were not engaged in complete subjugation, because the conflicts stopped by themselves and were localized. But this series of conflicts was much larger, bloodier, and the troops of Massalia then themselves went on the offensive, from which the victory seemed more perceptible. So the council decided to subdue the local tribes for good measure and to utilize their lands. The result, at the end of the war, or rather wars, the territory of Massalia increased 20 times, coming to the natural borders. The newly acquired lands were more fertile than the lands surrounding the city, where it was possible to grow only grapes and olives, which are more demanding to the climate than to the soil. So Massalia imported grain until the 3rd century. But now, on the new lands, it was possible to grow grains, so the dependence on imports disappeared. Plus, in large quantities there appeared cheap labor, slaves from among the captured Gauls, who could work there. A decent part of these lands went either to the state or to the oligarchy, mainly because the common people didn't argue with their decisions. They provided the militia with supplies and employed mercenaries. And what can I say, land ownership turned out to be quite a profitable business, and the oligarchs realized it when they smelled the profit. Plus, slaves were actively brought to Massalia, where they worked at manufactories, belonging again to the oligarchs and given no less money. Which meant they could do this kind of operation to conquer the barbarians again. And as I like to say, every decision has a person interested in its realization, especially in states with collective governance. And it was the oligarchy that became the driving force behind the future Massalian expansion. However, before the next expansion, it was necessary to gain a foothold in the already conquered lands, to build cities, roads, ports, to develop agriculture, and for all these needed citizens and free people. And the militia recruited only citizens, that is, Greeks. And given that now conquered barbarians were the vast majority of the population, with slaves somewhere around 40%, there were not enough Greeks to control all the lands. Moreover, with further conquests, the situation would get worse, and Greeks needed to find a way to get more Greeks. There was little sense to attract them from the east, because there just began colonization of the lands of the former Persian Empire by the Locals, and they themselves lacked people. And those guys had more money by dozens. Therefore, the only solution was to apply the principle of divide and conquer, naturalization of the part of the barbarians, so that they could control themselves. The choice fell on the Salis, because they were the closest to Massalia and therefore they observed Greek culture the most. The children of their chiefs were often educated there, they adopted the architecture, and the influence of the colonizers was manifested in their equipment. Few steps away from becoming Greeks, basically. And they got the civil rights. Well, not just them, but mostly them. Let me explain in order. You cannot give civil rights to a separate people or tribe. Passports were not invented then, and civil rights didn't really give anything except personal rights. All issues were anyway decided by the rich, so you can allow the barbarians to settle in the cities built on their territories. And thus salis, or rather cities on their lands, became open for barbarians, and for their children there were organized schools. On the rest of the lands, a barbarian had to pass an exam for knowledge of the Greek language, and if you somehow learned the language, you also would change your pants for a himation. Well, and the results of such reform were present, but a little bit different from what the Greeks expected. Yes, the militia grew, and the population was loyal, but the Salis formed a separate urban culture, absorbing the rest of the Celtic tribes, and did not really want to assimilate. This problem had to be solved a century later, imposing restrictions on clothing and banning their language. But at the time of the 3rd century, it suited the Greeks, and they have repeatedly conducted similar programs. In the countryside, there was active settlement by Greek colonists and cultural exchange between Greeks and Celts, with the former adopted mostly from the latter. The main thing adopted from the Gauls was the wheeled iron plough with coulter, a sharp knife that made a vertical cut and turned the soil over on itself. Such a miracle of engineering was not so often used at first, because the main labor force were slaves, and their masters didn't want to trust them with expensive tools. A hoe in hands and onward. But the plows were at least used by free Greek peasants, which allowed them to withstand competition with large landowners. So, the resources received from expansion went on increase of fleet, which in turn was necessary for expansion on the sea. No wonder. First, the Greeks, after a little persuasion by the fleet, managed to buy the town of Zakynthia from some Iberian tribe. It was either a former Greek colony or Greeks just lived there, which became the base for the invasion of the Gymnasian islands. The local tribes didn't offer much resistance, and the conquered islands allowed to create a zone of control over the northeastern coast of the Iberian Peninsula. All that remained was to seize this coast, and of the interesting targets here were the Greek cities, the existence of which I have already mentioned: Emporion, Rhodes, and others. Massalia demanded that they submit, and when they refused, started a war. The decisive defeat of the local militia, sieges and blockades of the cities, there was almost no looting by the way, were able to change the opinion of the polis, and those surrendered and passed into the patronage of Massalia. Immediately after that, the latter began a campaign against the Iberian tribes surrounding the cities, purely for security purposes, so to speak. In parallel, tensions with Carthage increased, caused by the growing influence of both states. Relations had always been tense. When the Greeks arrived in the western Mediterranean, the Phoenicians had already established themselves here, among whom was Carthage, and they were doing a lot of business here, so that the former had to be content with river trade. But during this time, Carthage conquered the islands of Corsica, Sardinia and Sicily, waged successful wars with the Iberians, and already threatened not only trade, but the very existence of Massalia. And so the Greeks acted decisively, openly provided a fleet to the Iberian kingdom of Carmoia, fighting with Carthage, and more importantly, entering into an alliance with the gaining power of Rome, which had its own claims to Carthage. They got control over the toe of the Apennine Peninsula, which Rome considered its sphere of influence. Therefore, the latter made an alliance with the Greeks, and in exchange for, let's be honest, betrayal of Taurinia, which they planned to conquer, and that very toe agreed to help them in the upcoming war. It began in 267 and was fought rather quickly, in just 3 years. First, the Greeks, without a declaration of war, landed on Corsica and Sardinia, having previously bribed the elites of the largest city and the former Greek colony on the former island, and without major battles occupied them. Most of the forces of Carthage at the time was in Iberia and Sicily, and on the latter the Romans took the brunt. The only major battle between Massalia and Carthage was fought at Hemeroscopion, between them and the army of Carmoia, which after losing the war had become a vassal of Carthage. After their defeat, Carthage realized that the war was clearly not in their favor, and agreed on a peace treaty under which Carmoia again became independent, Corsica and Sardinia passed under the control of Massalia, and Rome received his toll, all as agreed, in general. However, the latter, after its successes in Sicily, wanted more, Sicily itself, and wanted to continue the war, but without the support of the Massalian fleet could not do it, and therefore agreed to the peace treaty. But they held a grudge in doing so. We'll talk about that later. In any case, it was a complete success for Massalia, because the new possessions greatly increased their economic capabilities. Corsican coniferous forests became the main source of material for the construction of the fleet, and in Sardinia there were many large and wealthy cities. And to ensure their loyalty, they were given the same rights as the Greek ones. Sardinia also was more convenient to trade with the East, and by the time Massalia's exports were supplemented by furs, silver, wine, marble, wood, and an exclusive luxury product, Massalian glass, produced not in Massalia exactly, but in Emporion, where there was good scent and access to soda. Then the production was expanded to Tokis, on the Gymnasian Islands. And after a while, the producers there made a breakthrough by using a thin long metal tube to force air into the glass mold, thus creating thin glass. Within 100 years, their glass products became a desirable commodity throughout the Mediterranean, in addition to being favored by the barbarians of Kernov. Having strengthened economically and militarily, the Greeks could safely continue their expansion in Iberia, which became a race for the peninsula between Massalia and Carthage. After all, Iberia was both mines of metals, primarily silver, and excellent fertile land, and whoever owned Iberia would have superiority over the other. Therefore, Carthage made a major mistake, releasing Carmoia, because they became allies of Massalia, and with their presence alone prevented the expansion of the former to the north. Massalia in turn continued its movement southward, and by 256 had conquered the entire northeastern coast, reaching the borders of the possessions of Carthage. It became obvious that sooner or later a new war would begin. But before that, there was another major war against the coalition of Gauls, Biturigia, Arvernia, Aeduea. The reason was their centralization. After becoming republics with unified governance, they were able to control the trade passing along their rivers and accordingly impose duties, which in turn did not please the Greeks and they, well, went to war with them. Already not so barbarians provided a very determined resistance, winning several major battles. The war dragged on for 4 years, and the Greeks even had to call for help from the Romans, for whom the word Gauls was a trigger. With their support, a victory was secured and a peace treaty was concluded, which gave Massalia access to the Sea of Gallia, through the ports of which it traded with the north. Having recovered from that war by 232, the allies began a new war against Carthage. The main forces, the latter, again sent to Sicily. All in all, without it, Carthage as a polis would be open to invasion. And therefore, Massalians, on their front, achieved much greater success, and threatened to occupy all the possessions of Carthage in Iberia. But then, Rome decided to remind Massalia about the last war, and gave them a mean deal by going to a peace agreement with transfer under the control of the allies, those lands that were occupied by them at the time of the conclusion of the treaty. Eye for an eye, so to speak. In addition, Rome was going to have a war in the east, against Epirus and Macedonia, so that war had to end soon. The Massalians also had something to do. They began expansion deep into Iberia. By the 180s conquered its northern half. There, unlike the coast, were no civilized cities, and therefore the Greeks again had to create all the infrastructure from scratch, and again enlisted the support of barbarians to populate the cities. Among all the bunch of tribes, the choice fell on most numerous and scattered. Celtiberians. Not for nothing they didn't even have their own name. Kind of Celts, but sort of Iberians. Ideal amorphous material for assimilation. By the way, why did the Greeks had to bother with the creation of cities? The city performed several functions. It was the center of power and crafts in the province, a collection point for militia, assimilation again, But in addition, it was an important part of the administrative division of Massalia. The fact is that nominally, Massalia was not a single state, but a federation of polis with self-government, and each polis had a territory belonging to it, from which it collected militia and taxes, part of which they sent to the capital. In fact, since there were no elections to the Council of Massalia, they had no influence on the politics of the federation, and between Massalia and the polis stood an appointed governor from the former magistrates. Although among those 600 councillors there were often people from other cities, who raised capital on agriculture and metal mining, or glass trade, for example. In general, quite a good system of government. Because only the richest could be senators, everyone knew how much property they had, so they could not evade taxes. Offshore companies had not yet been invented, and they could not lower taxes for themselves, because in this case the crowd of citizens would just eat them up. What is even more interesting, at the time the strongest faction in the council was the faction of Democrats, who wanted to increase the influence of the citizens on this very council. And they even achieved the creation of an assembly to control its decisions. And there, ordinary people could be elected and voted in. Because of this, in Massalia even almost started a civil war, and was killed a senator who proposed this reform. But strangely enough, the majority of the council supported this change, and everything ended in their victory. Around the same time, another reform was made, the army one. With the growth of the size of the state, it became not convenient to collect militias from all territories, plus their quality was worse than that of the neighbors, at quite a small quantity. And to solve these problems, it was necessary to create a regular army. Roman legions were taken as a basis. The backbone of the army was a phalanx of hoplites and heavy infantry, armed with swords, adapted from the Iberians. But in general, they used different troops depending on the region. There were quite a lot of archers, the strengths of which the Greeks realized after the battles with the Celts, and light cavalry for quick skirmishes, and heavy shock cavalry to break the enemy formation. That is, the main tactic was a defensive formation, but the tactics of the barbarians they did not disdain, especially given their experience in confronting the heavy infantry of the Greeks. And who else used heavy infantry? The Romans. In the time since the last war with Carthage, they had gone from being the most important allies to the most dangerous enemies. The main initiator of the rupture of good relations were the Romans, but it certainly did not happen overnight. It all started, as I said, with an unpleasant for Rome peace agreement, but they were also dissatisfied with the fact that Corsica came under the control of Massalia. The thing is that when the Romans fought with the Etruscans for supremacy in the region, Corsica was under their rule. But Carthage seized the moment and invaded there, so the Romans had a claim on the island. It is clear that the main reason was the proximity of the island to Rome as a polis, but the cause was present. However, for a long time they put up with the fact that Corsica did not belong to them, because it was under the control of an ally, the closest to them in culture, religion and form of government of the state. They even both traced their genesis to the war-torn cities of Phocaea and Troy. Twin brothers, no less. But in Rome apparently were afraid of the growth of their brothers, and in very possible way tried to get a convincing reason for war with them. Basically, it was necessary for the Romans themselves, because in the Senate there were quite a lot of sympathizers of Massalia, which is not surprising given their similarity. And it was necessary to convince them that the Massalians are really bad, and sleep and see how to stab them in the back. The Roman ambassadors constantly insulted Massalia, and they seemed to support the separatism of the Saris, hoping to get a symmetrical response. But the Massalians tolerated the abuse, realizing where it was going. After all, they had similar disputes in their council. The Romans didn't think of anything better than to demand Massalia, which was then busy with the war with the Iberians, to participate in the war against the Gauls. And although the Greeks agreed to help, the war ended before they could do anything. The formal cause was gained, and the alliance broken. The Greeks themselves did not waste time either, and enlisted the support of Macedonia and Epirus, which had already had time to fight against Rome, and moreover humiliatingly lost. Rome took from Macedonia their capital Pella. They formed an anti-Roman coalition, which in total was stronger than Rome, and bound the latter from the west and east, leaving them the opportunity to expand only to the north. And this is, to put it mildly, not very good land for development, at least for the Romans. There are toga not to wear, and a soil hoe not to dig, needed a plow, and cities had to be built by themselves, the barbarians to fight in the end. Only problems, in general. That is why Greeks did not expand northward for a long time, especially when there is Iberia, comfortable for Mediterranean lifestyle. You can clearly see it on the map. With Carthage to fight also was not handy, because as soon as the Romans attacked it, the Greeks will do the same, and Carthage will rather defend Sicily than Iberia. So for a long time, about 60 years, there were no conflicts between Carthage and former allies. Greeks and Carthaginians even managed to establish trade again, because they were about equal in strength, and if they start fighting, Rome will eat them both. However, the latter came up with a pretty good plan. A sudden quick dash to occupy Sicily, and with the pressure of the newly built large fleet, which was even larger than the Carthaginian one, to force them to make a peace agreement, leaving Massalia and Carthage to fight each other, which would lead to a long and fruitless war given the parity of their forces. And the first part of the plan worked. Massalia did get involved in the war, and Carthage did go to the terms of Rome, but the rest of the plan went clearly not as expected by the Romans. Greeks quickly took the border Carthaginian fortresses and received operational freedom of action, and then one by one defeated superior to them in total numbers armies of Carthage. Much of this success can be attributed to the modernized Massalian army, but Massalian historians themselves, oddly enough, attribute much of the contribution to the victory to Sinorix Ambonus, a Celtiberian mercenary commander hired by the Greeks prior to the war. The fact is that this Celt had time to fight against the Greeks in their war with the tribe Eibocosia, where he was hired by the side of the latter, and thanks to his tactical skills, the Greeks won only at a numerical advantage. For example, at the Battle of Arbukale, he managed to inflict heavy losses on the Greeks when his army was outnumbered 3 times. Because of these losses, the Greeks were forced to stop advancing, because news of the battles reached Rome, and they already planned to take advantage of the weakness of the Greeks, and start a war against Massalia. By the way, exactly after this war, Massalia became concerned about the creation of a regular army, so perhaps he contributed to that as well. When his contract came to an end, Massalia hired him, mostly to keep him out of the way, as it was cheaper. But then the opportunity to use him for his intended purpose presented itself, and he was given the role of commander-in-chief. And he did not fail, smashing the armies of Carthage one by one. Among his most famous victories was the massacre of Oba, an ambush in which 11,000-strong army of Carthage was completely destroyed. The war also ended with his victory already in North Africa, where he defeated the last combat-ready forces of Carthage. The latter was forced to admit defeat with the transfer of Iberia and the Pillars of Heracles under the rule of Massalia, closing for Carthage access to trade with the North. In honor of this victory, in Empore even built a large temple of Heracles. Now they could easily finish off both Eibocosia and their former allies Carmoia, who refused to fight against Carthage, which was the cause for the war. Just like Rome. But their cities were granted civil rights after the conquest as former good friends. Carthage tried to prevent the expansion of Massalia by getting involved in the war on the side of Eibocosia, but after several defeats, washed its hands of the war. And so the peninsula came under the complete control of Massalia by 140. Urbanization was just underway there at this time, and Iberia was gradually transforming from a source of raw materials into a well-populated tax and recruit-generating region, at least the eastern part of it. In the west, cities were only to be built, such as the later largest city on west coast, Olysipon. It developed rapidly due to the new sea road from northern Europe to Massalia, plus it became a center for the production of fermented fish sauce, gyros, or garum, popularized by the Romans, which became a marketable commodity due to its good shelf life. Massalia as a polis also grew this time to 200,000–300,000 people. In the center of the city was built a huge commercial district, the Great Market, the center of Massalia's commercial activity, well known throughout the Mediterranean. Massalia's northern partners, the Dumnons, the ones who mined the tin, also benefited greatly from the trade, using the resources they obtained to unite the disparate tribes of the insular Celts into a single tribal union around the same time. Remarkable results of ancient globalization. Having finished conquering Iberia, Massalia gained the resources necessary to match the power of Rome. They spent several more decades integrating the new lands and preparing for the coming war. Because why should you be afraid of being attacked at a moment of weakness, if you can attack first at a moment of strength? First of all, they organized a campaign against Biturigia, fearing that they could stab in the back, or even worse, the Romans would use their lands to bypass the fortresses built by the Greeks in the Alps. The main reason why the Roman legions didn't go 100 miles and didn't take Massalia under siege during their war with Carthage, but waited for them to wear each other out, which I said didn't happen. So, the cause for the war was piracy. The Greeks, after gaining a monopoly on trade, were seriously engaged in this problem, and on the territory of Biturigia seemed to be pirate bases. 1+1 for a year were conquered their lands up to the river Liger, the same along which the Greek merchants used to trade. Now there were Greek cities with Greek walls. The existing fortifications in the cities bordering Rome were also strengthened. But still, the war with Rome was a serious and dangerous matter, so it was important to get a convincing reason to persuade themselves that it was necessary. The cause again became pirates, Ligurian ones, but this time they most likely really worked on Rome's order or with its approval, because they were based almost near the border. Having secured the support of Macedonia and having previously hired somewhere around 30,000 mercenaries, they demanded the Romans to deal with the problem. It is hard to say what would have happened if the Romans had met this demand. Yet it could have been a great point of reconciliation. The two peoples would have recognized each other's equality. But we will never know, because they responded with insults. The occasion for the war was gained, the people were charged. Awaiting the moment when Rome would start another war against the northern barbarians, the Greeks began to cross the Alps. Thus, in 110, the First Massalian Roman War began. The population of the parties was approximately equal, 8 million each. Rome had a greater mobilization resource, and Massalia had more money and material resources, and this influenced their strategies. The latter intended to wage a lone war without general battles with reliance on the fleet, quickly take the border Roman fortresses and the base of the Roman fleet, Genoa, and then defend them, while the Greek fleet and part of their army engaged in the realization of the real purpose of the war, the seizure of Sicily. The Romans, on the contrary, mobilized huge armies for the war on two fronts and wanted to swiftly march to Massalia, forcing those to surrender Sardinia and Corsica without invading these islands. Neither of them were right, though. But let's talk about everything in order. First, the Greeks crossed the borders through the Alps and along the coast, defeated the legions based there, and began a siege of Genoa and the largest border town, Augusta Taurinorum. The Greek fleet, in parallel, took Genoa in a blockade and defeated the Roman fleet, but the latter managed to escape, or at least that's what the Greeks thought at the time. In fact, the Greeks fell into a trap and were soon defeated. The Roman fleet was then managed by a tough admiral from Syracuse, and thus Massalia had to rebuild the fleet almost from scratch, giving the Romans complete freedom at sea for the first half of the war. Haste makes waste, you see. But Romans couldn't realize it, because it wasn't part of their plans, and they didn't expect such a victory. On the land, things were as follows. To those two cities arrived superior in number Roman legions, and at the same time attacked the besiegers. What the Romans did not expect is that in the Battle of Genoa they would lose 30,000 soldiers, with 10,000 Greek ones, and the Battle of Taurinorum they lost, because of which the city was taken without assault. Therefore, the Greeks had time to recover, and the war turned into a long, drawn-out mess in the Alps and its environs. A war to the last soldier. The Romans were pressed for time, because they mobilized almost everyone they could, and because disbanding militia would have been a foolish idea, they had to go on the offensive. Fortresses of Greeks were built so that to take them without great losses was problematic, but they closed not all the mountain passes. Well, because not everywhere you can build such fortifications. The main fortifications were border cities, anyway. Therefore, Romans have simply passed on free passes further to these cities, and that became their main mistake. The thing is that the Greeks had experience of battles in the mountains against a superior enemy. Say hi to the Celtiberian commander. And they took advantage of another weakness of the Romans in this war. The low quality of the army and the lack of officers, intercepting and smashing their legions one by one. Thus, using passes protected by fortresses, they inflicted huge losses and organized retreat. Benchmark examples are two battles in the same pass, a year apart. The first was a nominal defeat, but with Roman losses twice as high as Greek ones. The second was a complete annihilation of the Roman army, which was ambushed. As a result of such battles, of the 130,000 contingent that entered the lands of Massalia, only 20 of them escaped. Haste makes waste, after all. After this crushing defeat, the Romans offered to give Massalia Liguria, like deal with the pirate themselves. But inspired by this victory, they refused. And since the fleet was still under restoration and the war was fought on land, the Greeks decided to solve the problem in the Roman way. That is, to go to Rome. Yes, when your enemy has a state named after a city, it is reasonable to go to that city. As the 30,000 strong Greek army advanced towards Rome, the latter's offers grew rapidly. And by the time they arrived under the walls of the city, they offered to cede all the border provinces. But they never agreed to cede Sicily. Rome was taken siege and plundered. About half of the city was destroyed, and the same number of its inhabitants were killed or taken into slavery. The Senate building with the senators who had not escaped was burned, though they did not touch the temples. Greek historians attribute the blame for the pillage to the commander of mercenaries, whose army participated in the siege. But by the fact that after the end of the war nothing bad was done to him, we can judge that the council was not against such an outcome. After all, the weaker Rome as a polis, the weaker Rome as a state. The Romans were upset by such an event, to put it mildly, and they, as on a snap of fingers, have brought 80,000 soldiers. In reality, it was the returned armies from Macedonia. On that front, they have reached a crushing victory, and have taken away from those almost all Greece and Macedonia, in meaning of region. And although they had a couple of victories, the reinforcements did little to change the course of the war, because the Roman strategy remained the same. And 2 years later, they also ran towards the Alps. Figuring that now they are not threatened by anything, and having rebuilt the destroyed fleet, Greeks began to realize the original plan, and arranged an invasion of Sicily, defeated the very admiral who destroyed them, and without meeting resistance, continued the occupation on the mainland. The Romans, in turn, continued to persistently advance. In the last major battle, they even exchanged equal losses while being outnumbered, and a year later even tried to take Massalia, but seeing the local fortifications turned around, and were defeated by the approaching reinforcements. Thus, after 12 years of war, Rome hardly had 20,000 soldiers left, and they went to all the demands of the Greeks, and even more. Under possession of Massalia now was almost the whole Magna Graecia, a region with a large proportion of the Greek population. Exsanguinated and humiliated Rome, which lost about 400,000 soldiers, now had to fight against the barbarians, which they had previously held in an iron fist. Plus, sensing weakness, began to rebel recently conquered Greek polis in Greece. Massalia, having defeated its most dangerous rival at the turn of the 2nd and 1st centuries, found itself in a situation where it was already the strongest in the ecumeny, that is, in the world known to the Greeks. Carthage during this time did not become stronger, and couldn't become. Macedonia was beaten by Rome. In Ptolemaic Egypt there was dual power, plus in the south they were threatened by the Koshan kingdom, and the Seleucid country was falling apart at the seams. Yeah, it was problematic to trade with such unreliable neighbors, so the whole Hellenistic world needed order and prosperity. And how best to do it? By conquering them, of course. Even a claim was found: the liberation of Phocaea and all Greek polis from the power of tyrant monarchs. In 98, the council proclaimed the creation of the Phocian League, like Massalia is just the first of the equal polis, although everyone continued to refer to the state as Massalia. The Mediterranean was waiting for a century of constant wars, but that's material for another story, and this story will end here because I'm too lazy to paint them up in the color of the Phocian League. Thanks to the patrons who voted for the team for this story, unanimously by the way. You too can become one and participate in the future voting for the team of my first mega campaign, which will come after one video. Like and comment this video if you like it and want to support me, and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And with that, I bid you farewell.